Hi there. Welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a sound no one could explain. A voice, soft but clear, heard coming from an empty room. The house had been locked, the windows sealed. No one was inside. Yet more than one villager swore they heard someone speaking from the darkness within. Some called it imagination. Some called it a ghost. Miss Marple called it something far more dangerous, a message meant to be heard. Because voices don't choose empty rooms without reason. And in St. Mary Mead, even the quietest whisper can unravel a deadly truth. Before we step inside that silent room, don't forget to subscribe for more chilling Miss Marple mysteries. Chapter 1. The Voice That Should Not Exist. The wind moved softly across the village of St. Mary Mead, brushing over hedges and rattling the shutters of old cottages as if whispering secrets no one wished to repeat. It was the kind of night when silence felt heavier than usual, as though the darkness itself waited for something to happen. And in the far corner of the village, an empty house stood with one window lit, glowing faintly against the gloom. That was where everything began. The house belonged to the late Mrs. Harwood, quiet, well-liked, and widowed for many years. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks earlier, leaving behind an old stone cottage and decades of memories. Her niece, Miss Eleanor Harwood, had inherited the property and arrived to settle her aunt's affairs, but no one expected what happened next. People began to hear a voice inside the house, not a whisper, not the creaking of an old floor. A voice, clear, sharp, calling someone's name. And the worst part? The room where the voice came from was empty. Eleanor Harwood did not look like a woman easily frightened. She was 33, sharply dressed, and carried herself with the brisk energy of someone always in control. But the night she knocked on Miss Marple's door, her hands trembled, and her eyes showed pure fear. Miss Marple opened her door with gentle concern. Her white hair was neatly pinned back, and her expression was warm, with the kind of calm that made frightened people feel understood. "Oh, Miss Harwood, my dear," she said softly. "Do come in. You look as though you've seen something most unsettling." Eleanor stepped inside, swallowed, and forced herself to speak. "I wouldn't have disturbed you, Miss Marple, but I didn't know who else to turn to. And everyone in the village says you understand these things better than anyone." Miss Marple smiled politely. "I'm not sure about that, but I do try to make sense of little oddities when they appear." Eleanor took a breath. "It's about my aunt's house. Something is wrong there." Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea and waited. "There's a voice," Eleanor whispered. "A man's voice, in the small bedroom upstairs. I hear it every night after sunset, and the room is completely empty." She paused to steady her breathing. "It calls my aunt's name." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly, the way they always did when something peculiar surfaced. A man's voice? Not simply an echo, or someone outside the window. No, it comes from inside the room, and the house is locked. I lock every door myself. "How many nights has this happened?" Miss Marple asked. "4," Eleanor replied. "Always the same time, 10:30 at night." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And your aunt, dear Mrs. Harwood, she never mentioned hearing anything unusual in that room." "No, she used the room only for storage." Miss Marple placed her tea down and folded her hands neatly. "Would you like me to come and see the house with you?" Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "Yes, please." The house looked ordinary enough when they arrived. A garden filled with fallen autumn leaves, shutters slightly crooked from age, and a stone pathway winding to the door. Yet as they stepped inside, the air felt different, too still, too cold, as if the house had held its breath for years. Miss Marple walked through each room, her eyes quietly studying small details most people overlooked. "Did your aunt have many visitors?" she asked. "Not really. Only the vicar sometimes, and Mrs. Westing from next door, but that was more for tea and gossip." "And did she ever lock her doors during the day?" "All the time. Eleanor replied. She was careful, even nervous. She always said she felt someone was watching the house. Miss Marple paused. Did she now? That was interesting. Very interesting. They climbed the stairs, and Eleanor pointed to a narrow wooden door at the end of the landing. That's the room. Miss Marple opened it gently. Inside was a small square space, empty except for a wooden chair and an old chest against the wall. Dust lay thick across the floor. No fresh footprints. No sign anyone had entered. Miss Marple walked in slowly, her eyes moving with precision. She touched the wall. She checked the windows. She tapped the floorboards lightly with her cane. Then she knelt near the old chest. The lock was broken, its metal bent and twisted. Did you open this? She asked. Eleanor shook her head. No, I haven't touched anything in here. Miss Marple inspected the broken metal again. This was forced open. Not recently, but not long ago either. Eleanor looked even paler than before. What was my aunt keeping in there? That, Miss Marple said quietly, is one of the questions we must answer. From the landing, the grandfather clock chimed 8 times. The echo rolled through the house like a warning. Eleanor stepped back. The voice. It never comes until later. But I can show you where I was standing when I heard it. Yes, that would be most helpful. They moved to the hallway. Eleanor explained that she always heard the voice from just outside the door. It sounded as if someone inside the room stood only a few feet away, calling softly, Margaret, Margaret, Miss Margaret Harwood, her late aunt. Miss Marple listened carefully to the way Eleanor described the voice, its tone, its distance, its clarity. She made no assumptions, but she never dismissed details. Did your aunt ever mention knowing a man with a deep voice? Someone who called her name gently, perhaps. Eleanor hesitated. She never talked much about her past, but she did keep one photograph on her bedside table. A young man. She never said who he was. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Could I see the photograph? Eleanor nodded. Of course. The photograph lay in a silver frame, dusty but elegant. It showed a man in his 20s, smiling faintly, wearing a simple coat. His eyes looked kind, thoughtful, perhaps even loving. Miss Marple studied it for a long moment. Your aunt must have cared for him very much, she said quietly. People only keep a single photograph like this when it carries meaning. Eleanor swallowed. Do you think the voice belongs to him? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. I don't believe in voices from the dead, Miss Harwood. But I do believe people sometimes hide secrets for reasons we don't immediately understand. She turned slowly, her gaze drifting toward the stairs. Who else knew you were staying in the house? Only the vicar, and Mrs. Westing, and Mr. Phelps, the solicitor. Miss Marple nodded slowly. 3 people, all trustworthy, I assume. Eleanor nodded automatically, but Miss Marple noticed the flicker of uncertainty. And who knew your aunt kept this photograph? Eleanor blinked. I don't know. Miss Marple set the frame back gently. Well, she said, her voice calm yet alert. We shall wait for 10:30 tonight. I prefer to hear this voice myself. The hours passed heavily. They sat in the sitting room with only a dim lamp glowing. Rain tapped gently on the windows, a soft but steady rhythm. Miss Marple did not speak much. She watched the room, the hallway, the ceiling, every sound, every shift of wind. Eleanor paced, unable to sit still. When the clock chimed 10:30, both women froze. The house became unbearably still. The air thickened. Eleanor whispered, "It always starts now." And then, a soft sound drifted from upstairs, not the house settling. Not the wind, a voice, a man's voice, calling softly, slowly, clearly, "Margaret." Eleanor gripped the arm of the chair. That's it. That's the voice. Miss Marple stood immediately, her eyes narrowed. Not in fear, in calculation. She moved to the stairs with surprising speed for her age. Eleanor followed, shaking violently. The voice came again. Margaret. It was unmistakable now. A warm male voice, drifting down the staircase, like someone calling from behind a closed door. But Miss Marple did not go to the room. She went to the opposite side of the hallway. She pressed her palm against the wall, listened, pressed. Again, then she tapped the wall. Once with her cane. A hollow echo answered. Miss Marple turned, her expression sharp. "That room isn't empty," she said quietly. "Someone is behind the wall." Eleanor gasped. "Behind the wall? But that area is solid. There's no room there." Miss Marple's voice was steady. "There is a space, a narrow one, and someone has been using it." The voice sounded again, softer this time, as if fading away. "Margaret." Eleanor stepped back, horrified. Who would hide inside the walls? Why? What is happening? Miss Marple looked at her gravely. "Because your aunt knew something she should not have, and someone is trying to frighten you away before you discover it." The house creaked once more, not from age, but from movement, real movement. Someone was inside the walls, and they were not alone. Miss Marple tightened her grip on her cane. "My dear," she said softly, "I believe we are dealing with a living man, not a ghost." And in that moment, the floorboard behind them groaned. Someone was moving, slowly, deliberately, just out of sight. The voice was not gone. It was waiting. Chapter 2. The room with no door. The sound behind the wall was not loud. It was not a crash or a sudden step. It was the faintest scrape, like cloth brushing against old stone. Yet in the stillness of the hallway, it sounded as clear as thunder. Eleanor let out a sharp breath, one hand flying to her mouth. "Miss Marple, please tell me you hear that." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, my dear. I hear it very clearly." They stood frozen at the foot of the staircase, neither daring to move. The voice did not return at once. Instead, the house fell silent again, as though whoever hid within the walls had sensed that the game had changed. Miss Marple was the first to break the stillness. "We must not run," she said quietly. "Fear only gives such people what they want." "But someone is hiding inside the house," Eleanor whispered. "That's impossible. There is no space for anyone back there." Miss Marple turned and studied the hallway walls with careful eyes. Most older houses have unused spaces, sealed doorways, or narrow service corridors left behind from earlier designs. People forget these things, but criminals do not. She gently tested the paneling with her cane, tapping along every few inches, listening for differences in sound. Eleanor followed closely behind, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard. Tap, tap, tap. Then, a hollow sound. Miss Marple stopped at once. "This section," she murmured. She pressed the wood with her hand. It did not shift, but something about it was wrong. The grain ran in a slightly different direction. The nails were newer. "Someone patched this wall," she said, "and not very long ago." Eleanor felt faint. "You mean there is an opening behind it?" "Yes, a narrow crawl space, most likely, just wide enough for a man to hide." "And he's been living there?" Eleanor asked in disbelief. "Not living," Miss Marple replied. "Waiting." Before Eleanor could ask what she meant, the voice returned. "Margaret." This time, it came from higher up, somewhere near the ceiling. Eleanor cried out and grabbed Miss Marple's arm. "He's moving." "Yes," Miss Marple said firmly. "Which means he is frightened." Miss Marple moved with sudden purpose. She went straight to the nearest door on the landing and opened it. Inside was an unused linen closet. Shelves stood bare, the air stale. Miss Marple stepped inside and lifted her cane. With a firm push, she struck the back panel. The wood shifted, just barely. "There," she said. An access panel hidden behind the shelves. Eleanor stared, frozen with shock. "He can go through the walls. Like the house itself is hiding him." Miss Marple turned toward her, her face calm but serious. "My dear, you must go downstairs immediately and lock yourself in the sitting room. Bolted from the inside." "No," Eleanor said at once. "I won't leave you here alone." Miss Marple met her gaze steadily. "This man is dangerous. Not because he is violent, yet, but because he is trapped and desperate. Desperate people make foolish choices. The voice behind the wall came again, closer this time. Margaret, I know you hear me. Eleanor's face crumpled. He sounds so real, so broken. Why would someone pretend to be a ghost? Miss Marple answered softly. To drive you away from something he does not want you to find. She gently guided Eleanor toward the stairs. You must go now. I will not investigate further without assistance. Eleanor hesitated, then finally nodded. I'll call the police, she whispered. Yes, Miss Marple said. But do it from the vicarage, not from the house. Eleanor understood at once. If the man heard her calling, he might panic. Eleanor rushed down the stairs and disappeared through the front door. The moment it closed, Miss Marple stood alone in the house with only the unseen man hidden in the walls. The voice stopped. Silence swallowed everything. Miss Marple did not retreat. Instead, she returned to the hidden panel in the linen closet. She waited. Seconds passed. Then, a whisper, right behind the wall. You should not have stayed. Miss Marple replied gently. You should not have frightened an innocent woman. A pause, then a breath. Close. Very close. She was not innocent. Miss Marple's eyes hardened. You speak of Margaret Harwood, she said calmly. There was no answer. Miss Marple continued, carefully. She took something from you. Something you believe was never hers. A faint laugh drifted through the wall. She stole my life. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. I thought as much. The police arrived 30 minutes later. 2 officers entered the house with Rebecca Westing close behind them, trembling with worry. Eleanor returned with them. Pale and shaken, they searched the house from top to bottom, but the narrow crawl space behind the wall was empty that he was gone. The broken panel behind the linen closet was open from the inside. The man had slipped through some hidden passage and escaped before they arrived. One of the officers shook his head. No sign of him anywhere. Whoever this man is, he knows the house too well. Rebecca gasped. A man hiding in Mrs. Harwood's walls. That is madness. Miss Marple stood quietly near the staircase, her eyes distant. No, she said softly. It is not madness. It is grief twisted into obsession. The officers turned to her. I believe the man who hid in these walls once lived in this house, secretly, and he believed Margaret Harwood ruined his life. And how would you know that? One officer asked. Because he called her name with old emotion, Miss Marple replied. Not hatred, sorrow. The officers exchanged uneasy looks. Rebecca hugged herself tightly. But Margaret was such a sweet woman. She never hurt anyone. Miss Marple did not contradict her. Sweet people, she knew, were still capable of terrible mistakes. That night, Eleanor did not return to the house. She stayed at the vicarage under watch. Miss Marple returned home as well, but she did not sleep. Her thoughts circled one question. What had Margaret Harwood hidden? By morning, she had her answer. The solicitor, Mr. Phelps, arrived at Eleanor's breakfast table with urgent news. The inheritance papers were reviewed again last night, he said. There was a private clause added outside the main will, something that was never filed properly. Eleanor looked up in alarm. What sort of clause? Mr. Phelps swallowed. A property deed for a second structure on the land behind the cottage. Rebecca frowned. There is no second building. Miss Marple lifted her head sharply. There used to be, she said. All eyes turned to her. Years ago, Miss Marple continued, there was a small caretaker's cottage behind the main house. It was torn down after a scandal in the village. Mr. Phelps's face drained of color. You are correct. I found records confirming it. But the occupant vanished, and nothing was ever proven. Miss Marple spoke the truth they all felt. The man in the walls was that caretaker. Eleanor felt sick. Then my aunt. What did she do to him? Miss Marple answered gently but firmly. That remains to be discovered. They returned to the abandoned land behind the house that afternoon. What remained were only old stones, hidden beneath weeds, but Miss Marple noticed. One thing immediately a narrow iron pipe rising from the earth, nearly hidden. She knelt and brushed dirt away an air vent. This is how he breathed, she said quietly. How he listened, how he waited. Inside the ruined earth beneath the vent, they found a rotted mattress, scraps of clothing, and a small wooden box. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Margaret Harwood. None of them sent. Eleanor read the first one aloud, her voice shaking. I guarded your secrets. I kept quiet. I lost everything for you. But you promised you would return. You promised. Her hands trembled as she lowered the paper. Miss Marple closed her eyes. She abandoned him, she said, and left him to be ruined by the scandal alone. Rebecca whispered. Then the voice. It wasn't just fear. It was a demand. Yes, Miss Marple answered. He wanted her to admit the harm she caused, even in death. A sudden sound behind them made everyone turn. Footsteps, heavy, running. The caretaker appeared at the edge of the trees, wild-eyed, unshaven, thin as a shadow. The man from inside the walls, he saw the box in Eleanor's hands, and he broke. That was mine, he shouted. The officers moved at once, but before he could be seized, the man collapsed to his knees, weeping like a child. She ruined me, and then she died without ever facing me. Miss Marple stepped forward slowly. Sir, she said gently, you frightened her niece instead. You became the very thing you hated. The man bowed his head. The voice that haunted the empty room was silenced at last, but the truth he carried was not yet complete. Chapter 3. The voice finally answered. The man did not resist when the officers led him away. He walked with his head bowed, as if the fight had left him the moment his secret was pulled into the light. The forest seemed to grow quiet again after his cries faded, and only the wind stirred the tall grass around the ruined stones of the forgotten cottage. Eleanor stood frozen, still holding the small wooden box of letters as though it might vanish if she let go. So it was all true, she whispered. My aunt destroyed his life, and never spoke of it. Miss Marple looked at her gently. Your aunt was a woman of kindness in her later years. But kindness does not erase past mistakes, my dear. It only tries to outrun them. The officers escorted the caretaker, whose name they finally learned was Samuel Rowe, to the waiting vehicle. As they drove away, Miss Marple felt no triumph, only sorrow. This had never been a story of greed or sudden rage. It had been a long, quiet cruelty, slow and buried, and those were always the hardest cases of all. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple, Eleanor, Rebecca, and the vicar gathered inside the sitting room of the Harwood house. The curtains were open wide now, letting daylight spill into corners that had known only shadows. During the nights of fear, the room felt different, lighter, but the truth still sat heavy in the air. Miss Marple took one of the letters from the wooden box and read aloud carefully, making sure every word was clear. They found us, she read softly. They say I shamed you. They say the child was not yours to bear. I begged them to stay silent. I begged you not to send me away. Eleanor covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Child? She whispered. Yes, Miss Marple said. There was a child in this story, and that is why everything unfolded as it did. The vicar leaned forward. Margaret was never known to be with child, because she ensured no one ever knew. Miss Marple replied. She picked up another letter. Samuel Rowe and Margaret Harwood loved each other deeply when they were young. But in those days, class mattered more than truth. She came from a respected family. He was only the caretaker's son. Rebecca lowered her gaze, ashamed. When Margaret became pregnant, fear overtook her. Not fear of motherhood, but fear of disgrace. Eleanor's breath hitched. What happened to the child? Miss Marple closed the letter slowly. The child was taken from her at birth. Officially, it was recorded as stillborn. In truth, Samuel believed the baby was sent away in secret. He never stopped searching. The room fell silent, heavy and unbearable. And my aunt? Eleanor asked. Miss Marple hesitated. Margaret chose safety. She chose reputation. And she let a man believe his child had vanished forever. Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. She lived her whole life pretending she had never done this. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. And Samuel lived his whole life inside that wound. The vicar bowed his head in prayer. Rebecca whispered. And the voice, Miss Marple finished, was not meant to frighten the living. It was meant to awaken the dead. In his mind, Margaret owed him one final truth. That evening, the house stood strangely peaceful for the first time since Eleanor had arrived. Yet no one slept easily. Near midnight, Eleanor heard something at last. Not a voice, footsteps, soft ones. She rose from her bed and stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding. The house was silent again. She told herself it was only memory echoing fear, but then she saw it. The hidden panel inside the linen closet stood open once more. Eleanor felt a rush of cold terror. She ran. Miss Marple arrived moments later, with the vicar and Rebecca close behind. He is gone, Eleanor whispered. Miss Marple nodded slowly. He was never meant to stay after this truth was uncovered. His purpose here has ended. They searched the space behind the wall one final time. In the narrow corridor beyond, they found a single object left carefully behind, a folded letter that it was addressed to Margaret Harwood. Miss Marple unfolded it and read aloud. I heard your voice every night, even after you died. But you never heard mine when I begged you not to take my child. I no longer need to hide behind your walls. The truth is out now. That is all I ever wanted. Eleanor wept openly. The voice would never return. Days later, new information arrived from distant records. A young woman had been found decades ago and adopted into a different family under sealed identity. She was Samuel's daughter, and she was still alive. But Samuel Rowe died 2 nights after his arrest from long-ignored illness and exhaustion. He never lived to know that the child he mourned had grown into a woman with a family of her own. Miss Marple folded the final letter and placed it back into its box. Some truths arrive too late, she said softly. But they always arrive. The house was sold soon after. Eleanor chose not to keep it. I don't think this place should ever hear another lie, she said quietly. Miss Marple understood on her last evening in St. Mary Mead. Eleanor walked with Miss Marple through the village garden. I thought the voice was a ghost, Eleanor said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. We often call unresolved pain a ghost. It sounds the same in the dark. Eleanor looked at her with gratitude. You saved me. No, Miss Marple said gently. You were only listening to a story that had waited many years to be heard. The wind brushed past them softly. There was no more whispered in, oh more fear. Only quiet at last. And so, the empty room is silent again. Not because a ghost was banished, but because a long-buried truth was finally heard that if this story moved you, if the mystery held you, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling Miss Marple mysteries like this one. Your support helps these stories live on, and who knows, another voice may already be waiting in another empty room.